Talk about the unruly domestic political situation Justin Trudeau is facing. The international situation is not a whole lot better. What's your assessment of things?
No, it really isn't. I mean, Canada, as a relatively small country in the world in terms of power, and one that's particularly dependent on an open trading system and our relations with the United States, the changing conditions that we've seen have really impacted us. Our principal ally, our principal trading partner, has become much less reliable. As you know, we've been targeted by a couple of authoritarian states, China and Saudi Arabia, because they think they can get away with it, which is a sign of a new kind of international arrangement that we're seeing. And our traditional partners in Europe, those liberal democracies that we rely on to work with in the world, are themselves consumed, many of them, by their own internal struggles. So it's a difficult time. Canada's interests are more exposed, I think, than they have been since the end of World War II. The only time that I would say is a close comparison is that moment after 9/11 when the United States shut down the border. But that was a moment, it was a crisis, it was resolved, whereas what we're looking at now are changing conditions.
Right, it's like a trend, right? This unraveling of things that we've sort of relied on since the end of the Second World War. So if you're this government in a minority situation where so much of your focus is going to be internal now, how do you approach this?
Well, like anything else, by identifying priorities. You can't do everything, but the things that you do have to be extremely important, and you have to throw yourself into them and do them well. Top of the list, of course, is the United States. It's a mistake to assume that this phenomenon that we're witnessing in the U.S. will simply pass when Trump leaves office, whether it's next year or 5 years from now. The forces that brought Trump to power will remain within the U.S. body politic. He has remade the Republican Party for now as an America First party. The Republican Party is now anti-trade. So number one is we have to treat the United States relationship with the same urgency that we were treating it with during the NAFTA negotiations. In other words, we need to maintain and maybe even further upgrade that machinery of outreach and engagement with the United States at all levels that we've had so far.
So rather than retrench, now that it looks like NAFTA, UMSCA, whatever you want to call it, appears to be close to the finish line, keep going, flood the zone even more.
You have to treat this as a situation that could become urgent at any moment because of the unpredictability of the Trump administration. But it's not just the Trump administration. It's the notion that we have been able to rely on the United States not to use its disproportionate power to hurt us. We've had disputes with the U.S. before, but we've been able to more or less rely on the United States to treat the friendship as a core friendship. I'm not sure that we can do that anymore, so we have to be there, and we have to be identifying problems before they arise and heading them off when they do arise.
You look across the ocean, too. I mean, the United Kingdom is going into an election. The EU is potentially unraveling or on the verge, or at least losing a major player. Conditions are changing in Italy quite rapidly. Germany is changing. We focus so much on the United States because of the proximity, the size, and the trade relations. What does Canada need to worry about most with Europe?
Well, you know, our economic future, the future trade relations for Canada really lies more in Asia than in Europe because Asia has become the center of global economic growth. But Europe is where our friends are. And as a small or middle-sized power, we need friends in the world. We need to be able to work with friends, particularly those that share our values. So we have a stake in what's happening in Europe to our friends and with our friends. And there, we need to continue to try to work with specific European countries and with the European Union to sustain elements of the multilateral system that are under threat. Perfect example is the work that's going on with the WTO and the multilateral trading system. That needs to continue. We need to be working with them on rules to govern the use of cyber tools and cyber weapons. We need cyber arms control. We're entering a whole new world. And finally, in the area of refugees, Canada has expertise. There are millions of refugees stuck in limbo outside of Europe. Those people have very little hope of returning home. Canada and other countries can provide the youth of those countries, of those refugee populations, with the kind of education and hope that would help to deal with that development and security problem now.
How do you move ahead on some of these new challenges, though? When you look at, we've got the NATO Leader Summit coming up, for example, in London. NATO has been unraveling is maybe too strong a word, but Trump has been doing everything he can to undermine it, calling everyone a freeloader. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, has said some critical things about how you can't rely on the United States anymore. How do you deal with these new emerging problems when the old institutions are starting to struggle?
Well, NATO is under tremendous strain, but it has been, the things that NATO is doing, the deployment to Eastern Europe, the number of troops that are there in battle groups, including Canada and Latvia, the steps that it's taking to deter and counter Russia's more aggressive moves. It's really actually surprising how intact NATO is, considering the political turmoil that's surrounding it. That said, eventually, the core of NATO will begin to be under even greater strain. I don't know how many years of Trump that alliance can sustain. I don't know how many years of Trump the U.S.-South Korea alliance can sustain, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't know exactly where the United States is going to be a few years from now. I said the United States has changed, and we should assume that we're going to be at risk going forward. But there's also a chance that there'll be a moderation in U.S. policy. So our job now is to sustain the structures that are there as best as we can.
With all of this happening, with the disruptive effect that Trump has had on a lot of international institutions, sort of China is out there as well, and Canada's relationship with that country strained, to put it mildly. How do you deal with this going forward?
Well, I think it's encouraging that we've seen the nomination of ministers, of ambassadors from both sides, Chinese ambassador to Canada, Canadian ambassador to China. The countries are talking again. China lifted some of its trade restrictions on some of our agricultural exports, albeit for their own internal reasons. But, you know, they could have kept them there if they wanted to. So the signs are encouraging that this dispute is at least contained. And I think that that's what's important. Number one, to keep getting our allies, our partners, including our European partners and the United States, to be putting pressure on China with regard to the 2 Canadians they're holding. But number two, to be keeping the temperature down. Because China can out-escalate Canada. And alone, we cannot force China to take action. So keeping the temperature down, and it's encouraging, we've seen that. But I don't see there being much prospect for a significant improvement in that relationship until the situation of the detainees is dealt with.
The ambassadors are in place. The new cabinet will be sworn in on November 20th. There's a lot of talk about maybe a change in foreign affairs, of bringing Chrystia Freeland back and deploying her to a domestic portfolio. Is it a good idea to change your top diplomat at this sort of stage in world affairs? What would your advice be to the Prime Minister if we asked you about that in cabinet today?
Well, Chrystia Freeland has been an excellent foreign minister, and she's been an excellent foreign minister during a pretty critical time. She helped to close the CETA trade deal with Europe, and of course she managed the relations with the United States during that very difficult period. I think that there is a structure in place now for managing relations with the U.S. The people are going to be critically important, who our new ambassador to the U.S. is, and we'll need a strong person as foreign minister, whether it's Chrystia Freeland or someone else. But that foreign minister is also going to have to pay attention to Asia. And as much as we talk about China, we really need an Asia strategy, if not only for our economic future. And that means identifying specific countries that are critically important potential partners, that partnerships can be grown. And you know, I could list what the countries could be. Others might have different views, but list them, identify them. Pour your attention into those countries. This is where the future growth is, and we have an interest both in expanding our exports in this less stable world and also in reducing, to the extent that we can, our dependence on the United States.
If not Freeland, who would you put in there?
Oh, there's plenty of options.
All right, we'll leave it there. Roland Paris, thanks so much.
Thank you.